Discipline and Punish is a 1975 work of social theory by the French thinker Michel Foucault. Foucault was born into an upper-middle-class family in France in 1926. He studied philosophy at the École normale supérieure in Paris, and in 1961 published his first book, Madness and Civilisation, about the evolution of the notion of mental illness since the medieval period. His subsequent work focused on notions of exclusion, deviation, and knowledge in different eras. He died from AIDS-related septicaemia in 1984. Discipline and Punish is subtitled The Birth of the Prison. It's in 4 parts and it traces the history of punishment primarily in France, although France is meant to be generalizable, since medieval times. Part 1, entitled Torture, begins with a graphic contemporary account of the execution of Damien the Regicide in 1757. First, what was meant to happen, then how it actually panned out, since it was partly botched by the executioners. The idea was that the flesh would be pulled from the criminal's arms, chest, thighs, and calves with red-hot pincers. Then a mixture of molten lead, oil, and sulfur would be poured on the wounds. Then his hand would be destroyed with burning sulfur, and finally he'd be torn apart by 4 horses, one pulling at each limb. That was the plan. In reality, the horses couldn't manage it, so the executioner had to help out by cutting the body. Foucault sees this as a spectacle designed to reinforce the legitimacy of the sovereign. The criminal had symbolically attacked the whole body politic of which the sovereign was head. By its very nature, the crime was an unlimited attack, so it had to have unlimited consequences. This whole ideology had begun to break down even before the time of Damien the Regicide. Firstly, it was often self-defeating. Sometimes the crowd sympathized with the criminal and violent disorder ensued. Sometimes the criminals themselves wouldn't play along. Instead of expressing contrition, they cursed their executors. In both cases, the dignity of the sovereign was undermined. Finally, there was the growing sense that even in the worst criminals, some semblance of humanity remained. Alongside this, crimes themselves changed. From the end of the 17th century, Foucault tells us, one observes a considerable diminution in the number of murders, and generally speaking, in physical acts of aggression. Offences against property seem to take over from crimes of violence. Better means of detection meant that large gangs of malefactors gave way to smaller, less ambitious groups. There was a shift from a criminality of blood to a criminality of fraud. The criticism of the judicial reformers, Foucault tells us, was directed not so much at the weakness or cruelty of those in authority as at a bad economy of power. This dysfunction of power was related to a central excess, what might be called the monarchical superpower, which identified the right to punish with the personal power of the sovereign. This initial stage of reform aimed to change the system from one that was weak at some points, excessive at others, and full of loopholes, to one that was much more internally balanced. This soon gave way to a second stage of reform in which the medieval idea of deterrent was reimagined. The new idea was that one must punish exactly enough to prevent repetition, which had 2 consequences. Firstly, the punishment must fit the crime and the possible punishments must be publicized. Secondly, the means of surveillance had to be improved. Knowing the police are watching you, you'll be far less likely to offend. So the police and the judiciary began to work together. Surveillance became intrinsic to the system. Ultimately, the task of devising different punishments for different crimes proved too much. What happened instead is that nearly all crimes were met with detention, differentiated by length of time. Surveillance moved inside the prison since it came to be considered good practice, given that the aim was to prevent reoffending, to educate and thus reform the inmates. The same tactics were applied in several different types of institutions simultaneously, of which prisons were just one. Hospitals, schools, and barracks were among the others. Reform and surveillance now began to work hand in hand. The last section of Part 3 of Discipline and Punish is called panopticism. and discusses Jeremy Bentham's 1785 design for a supposedly perfectly humane prison, which he thought could equally well be applied to hospitals, schools, factories, and asylums. Bentham's panopticon, from two Greek words meaning all-seeing, is a circular building with cells on its circumference and an observation tower in the middle. The central observer can see the cell's occupants. There are windows in each outward-facing wall, but the occupants can't see the observer or other occupants because there are walls between the cells. The idea is that the occupants would never know whether or not they were being watched. To be on the safe side, they'd have to assume they were, so they'd always behave. Although much to Bentham's annoyance, no panopticon was ever built, Foucault plausibly sees it as the ideal underlying all modern punishment systems and more. We live in what he calls a disciplinary society, in which we're all being watched by an abstract supervisor, who may often be no one at all. That's why, although we live in liberal democracies, we're not really free. We have a formal system of horizontal political freedom, but our workplaces are usually rigidly top-down, and our freedoms of speech, association, and behaviour are curtailed. The contract, he says, may have been regarded as the ideal foundation of law and political power. Panopticism constituted the technique, universally widespread, of coercion. It continued to work in depth on the juridical structures of society in order to make the effective mechanisms of power function in opposition to the formal framework it had acquired. The Enlightenment, which discovered the liberties, also invented the disciplines. The last section of the book examines the phenomenon of delinquency. While prison claims to reform, it focuses on and defines the person rather than the offence, and so it creates a community of delinquents whose crime is somehow written into them, which can be useful for the authorities because when these people are released back into society, they're likely to reoffend, and so can reveal new criminals, and in the last resort, they can be co-opted as informers. Foucault was fully aware that prisons had never worked as they were supposed to. On page 268, he added an obviously late footnote about a series of uprisings in French prisons between 1972 and 1975. There have been many uprisings before, he says, and there'll undoubtedly be many more in the future. The official response is always the same. The system hasn't been implemented properly. Now we must implement it properly. In summary, Discipline and Punish is profound. Unlike many works of continental philosophy, it isn't a difficult read, and it's well argued. Its weakness, perhaps, is that it considers the French experience to be universal, and that it doesn't consider any alternatives. It's an analysis, that's all. I'll say all. Apologies.